Welcome to At Home and Abroad with Harris and Walker. Join us each week as we follow our curiosity, diving deep into the familiar and the foreign. Reach beyond your front door as we uncover new perspectives, explore intriguing ideas, and have real conversations with the best guests. Ready for something different? Let's get started. The setting is the Microscope Gallery in Brooklyn, New York on October 8th, 2011. The audience is eagerly awaiting the performance of artist Marnie Kotak. The gallery was fashioned into a home birth center adorned with images of babies, and just a few days prior to the performance itself, Kotak spoke with gallery visitors on two important topics, art and motherhood. Those individuals who were interested in attending the subsequent performance were invited to come along. The performance piece was entitled The Birth of Baby X. There were two stars of the show, Kotak and her brand new baby Ajax, who she delivered live in front of the audience. She was attended throughout by a midwife and a doula, and was known to say that the performance would show that giving birth, the greatest expression of life, is the highest form of art. Though this performance celebrated the natural and healthy birth of a child, it also was highly criticized. Critics found it exploitative, seeking shock value, narcissistic, and most blatantly, not art.
It really comes down to choice, though, doesn't it, Harris?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of public birth for myself, but as long as she and the baby were safe, what's the big deal?
Seriously. And really, it is a beautiful, gory, messy, lovely, life-altering thing. We all experience it from one angle or another. And even though we all know how it's supposed to go, it can offer up a lot of surprises too. Do you remember that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it was like the go-to guide for all moms to be. But really, it totally freaked me out. Did it freak you out?
Oh, absolutely. I was totally freaked out by it. I don't remember a section on having a baby in an art gallery, though.
No.
Most people opt for a hospital delivery or an at-home delivery, right?
Most definitely.
Yeah, but no matter how well we try to plan ahead for a birth, well, Mother Nature sometimes has different plans.
Mm-hmm. Our little bundles of joy sometimes arrive unexpectedly, like on airplanes or at the side of the road.
I believe there's a woman who just recently gave birth on an Air Canada flight.
You're right. These babies do pop out when we're trying to get somewhere.
Right.
One woman in Fullerton, California, went into labor when she was on her way home from the shopping mall. She called 911, but she had already delivered her own baby in the driveway by the time the police arrived. I think that's a big well done, mama.
Me too. My own great-grandmother, who lived on the Manitoba prairies in the 1920s, had called to her daughter, who is my grandmother, to call the doctor, but by the time the doctor arrived, she also had given birth by herself and cut and tied the umbilical cord.
Wow. These women are impressive. They delivered their own babies out of necessity, but really, that was the way it always has been since the dawn of time, right?
Still, I cannot imagine doing the same.
No, me neither. But we would if we had to, right? Like Carolina Chirinza. This intrepid mother gave birth in a tree during a flood in Mozambique.
Come on.
I am not kidding. Apparently, the floodwaters were rising, so she climbed a tree to get herself out of harm's way because also the water was infested with crocodiles. According to the media, without food or water, she remained there for 4 days before her baby was born. And thank goodness, they were both rescued. But Walker, she was in a tree with crocodiles circling the bottom.
Unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Now, you have 3 children, Harris. Mm-hmm. Your birthing experiences were all very different, and they weren't without some stressful, unexpected events as well.
Well, they didn't involve floods or crocodiles, thank God. Yeah, but with the exception of my daughter, they were pretty stressful. In fact, after number 3, my care team and I decided that another baby would just not be in the cards for me.
So give us a little insight into that.
Well, I think I've mentioned it before, but my first child almost died at birth. He had what was called shoulder dystocia, which is a bit of a nightmare complication. So he suffered a prolonged lack of oxygen. Thank goodness he survived. And though he does have cerebral palsy, he is a whopping 22 years old now and living his best life. So all is well. And my daughter came hot on his heels, but she didn't have any problems. But then I had my third kid, and I had a serious cardiac event during delivery. So it was a little stressful. But for all of those moms to be out there, it still was all worth it.
Too true.
So what about your wee ones, Walker?
Well, I've had two babies, but my birthing experiences weren't nearly as stressful. The first time I encountered issues moving the process along, and I did have an issue with the epidural. I won't get into the details, but both of them ended up being fairly uneventful C-sections. The biggest surprise was finding out, really, that I was having a son instead of a daughter. Surprise!
Oh, that's cute.
Sometimes, though, the surprise is that there's a baby at all. Some women give birth and have no idea they were pregnant.
Right, like a cryptic pregnancy.
Something similar happened to someone I knew, actually.
Wow, that's crazy. But I guess if you have irregular periods, you might not figure it out until much later in the pregnancy.
Well, that would certainly make it all a bit trickier.
The Cleveland Clinic adds that these kinds of things can happen if women are not educated to recognize the signs of pregnancy or if they have conducted a pregnancy test and it shows a negative result.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. Giving birth is obviously an integral part of being a human being and other species as well. Yet it never ceases to amaze me how even today women can still encounter complications during childbirth, and some of these are life-threatening. According to the World Health Organization, in fact, in 2020, almost 800 women died each day that year due to preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth.
Terrible.
Some of the complications women face are high blood pressure during pregnancy, severe bleeding and infection, often after they've given birth, complications encountered during the process of delivery, like me, and abortions, which are conducted in an unsafe manner.
Yes, and of course, the mortality rate is significantly higher where women do not have access to adequate care, whether it be doctors, nurses, and or midwives.
Absolutely. The World Health Organization identifies poor women who live in remote areas as least likely to have access to acceptable health care. In contrast, in most high-income and upper-income countries, roughly 99% of all births benefit from a trained midwife, doctor, or nurse. But this figure drops to 78% in lower middle income and 68% in low income countries. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Kristine Lauria. Kristine Lauria is an international midwife and expert in high-risk maternity care and low-resource environments. She has attended over 5,000 births in more than 25 countries around the world. Kristine is also a staunch advocate for undisturbed physiologic birth. Welcome to At Home and Abroad, Kristine.
Thank you. I'm just delighted to be here.
We are as delighted, if not more. So let's just begin with what drew you to the work of a midwife in the beginning.
Oh, I was in my mid-20s and that's when I started. But I have to say, I grew up with my mother. I was the oldest, and she was kind of eternally pregnant. She was having babies until I was 14 years old. My youngest brother was born when I was 14. So I was just always around somebody who was pregnant and, little babies. And she made pregnancy very normal, and it just was an example to me that, it's just a no big deal. And she had her babies in the hospital, and then I ended up being a home birth midwife. But she still sort of mirrored that birth is a normal and natural process, pregnancy and birth both. So really, I think that was her influence. Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful thing to be able to witness birth as an integral part of our lives, right in your own childhood.
Yeah.
So with Doctors Without Borders, you assist women with their sexual and reproductive health. So can you tell us why you feel this aid is so important?
Yeah, so Doctors Without Borders, or MSF as we call it in the field, is they're a humanitarian aid organization, and we work in disaster areas, places with armed conflicts. We go to places with disease outbreaks and so forth. But part of what they do is sexual and reproductive health, and it's the midwives that do that in the field. And this encompasses not just maternity care, but also contraceptive care, safe abortion care, and also sexual violence. Because in a lot of those areas where there are armed conflicts, refugee camps, there's a very high rate of gender-based violence. And so it's the role of the midwife to tend to those survivors of the sexual violence. So it's a big part of what we do.
Yeah, and a very important part of what you do. Thank you for doing that work. Having worked extensively internationally, can you explain how our attitude towards midwifery here in North America differs from other parts in the world? Do you face different attitudes when you're overseas with MSF?
In many countries, midwifery is part of the healthcare system. In the countries that have the best maternal and neonatal outcomes, midwives are the primary care providers for women and babies during the childbearing year. And in lower resourced countries, traditional midwives have always been what women have used as care. And when they go into maternity centers or hospitals, in certain countries, midwives still are the primary care providers. And in other countries, such as ours, it's physicians that have taken over the care of women during birth. And we see worse outcomes when we put surgeons in the place of midwives to care for normal, healthy, pregnant women. And even some that are higher risk, like in the countries where I go, there are no obstetricians in many of the settings where I've been working, and we manage even the higher risk things with very little in terms of resources, and then we refer for a cesarean rarely, and it's usually because the mother's life is in danger. It's never to save the baby. It's always if the mother's life is in danger. So cesarean rate is about 5% in places where I go. Very low.
Really?
Yes.
And now I feel, and maybe this is just anecdotally, but I feel that a lot of women are choosing cesarean for their birth plan. Why do you think that is the case in terms of poorer outcomes when it's more of a medically assisted birth as opposed to a midwife being the primary caregiver?
Birth is a normal physiological process. It's not a medical event. And when you take a healthy mother and presumably healthy baby, because if we've done all of the things, the fetal surveillance and so forth, we're assuming the baby's healthy unless something's been found otherwise. Although sometimes once they're born, it's like, oh, we didn't know this. So I say presumably healthy baby. And when you put them in the hands of somebody that specializes in pathology and surgical birth, that's what they're going to see. They're looking for pathology. Midwives aren't looking for pathology. We're expecting normal. And then if something comes up, if the blood pressure rises, if there's an issue with blood sugar, then they address it. But they're not specifically looking to find a problem that they're going to have to correct. When we meddle in a normal birth, somebody just walking into a maternity unit and they're in labor, especially a first-time mother, and then we're putting our hands inside them every 2 hours and telling them how well they're doing or not how well they're doing. They're lying in a bed. They're attached to monitors. They're in an IV, and they have all these things, these devices around them. It turns birth into a medical event, and it interferes with the process. The bottom line is that we're mammals, and mammals are, and a lot of people don't like to hear this. It's like, well, no, we're mammals.
We are.
And mammals need a dark, quiet place to give birth. It's a very primal thing. We access the primal part of our brain. It's not something we think about doing. You have to get into that primal space in order to be able to really just birth your baby easily and quickly. And so there's time limits on all of these things in hospitals. And so 1 out of every 3 women in North America is being given a cesarean section. 1 in 3. 1 in 3 women can't birth their babies vaginally. No.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. And it also speaks to just the experience of the mother as well, going through the birth process, whether it's, in a very pristine, sterile, bright, perhaps, unfamiliar environment, or going to that primal place and a dark, cozy, comforting environment.
So you believe in the autonomy of choice and respect to a birth experience. Why do you feel so strongly about this, Kristine?
Well, primarily because there are a lot of people out there that would like to legislate birth. And in fact, they do. And every state is different in the US. And I know Canada also has issues with what midwives can and cannot do at home and who can stay at home and birth their baby. And if you were going to have a baby and you planned on going to the hospital and getting an epidural, and that's where you felt safe to birth, and somebody told you, well, no, you're low risk. There's no reason you need to be in a hospital and you don't need pain management. We'll rub your back and you can use the water. You know, a lot of people have water births at home or they're in their showers. It's okay. And you didn't want to do that. Imagine nobody would ever do that or say that. And it's the same thing for if we reverse it and tell somebody they have to birth in the hospital when they want to birth at home, and then they can't find a midwife because the midwives are like Louisiana, for example. It's a horrible state for midwives. A woman at the beginning of her pregnancy has to go to an obstetrician to ask permission to have a home birth. Like, do you find me suitable for a home birth? Like, and oftentimes they're told no because of some tiny little thing, but it's some obstetrician's choice whether or
Yeah.
not he or she is going to allow this woman to stay home. We're not talking about high risk people. It's written in their legislation that women have to seek the care of an obstetrician first to get the thumbs up for a home birth.
It goes back to reproductive choice,
It does. It
right?
really does. Yeah.
It's something that as women, we're just battling. And I feel like the tide is raging against us again as women in your country and our country as well, because midwifery is not integrated into our medical system at all. It's something you have to source outside, you know, and that impacts the whole profession too, right? If it's
Yep.
not completely accommodated within
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
culture.
Exactly. And when you look at the history of midwifery at the turn of the last century, that's when there was a big, huge campaign in the US to malign midwives. And you can find old posters online of them talking about, you know, midwives and they have dirt under their fingernails and they're uneducated and they don't know what they're doing and just in an effort to scare people to go into hospitals. Meanwhile, they didn't know yet because they weren't listening to Semmelweis, that you had to wash your hands when you went from a cadaver to somebody giving birth. And women were dying of childbed fever in huge numbers, and they couldn't figure it out. And Semmelweis said, "You got to wash your hands." And then they laughed at him. And it wasn't until after he died that they're like, "Oh, he was right." And yet they were still, you know, really maligned, and midwives were drowned and burned at the stake as witches because they used herbs. They used herbs and the herbs worked. And that was witchcraft.
So your work must have some lows and highs. Can you share with us an experience that stands out? You know, in all the decades that you've been doing this work, I'm sure you've had some pretty phenomenal experiences.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, I've been doing this for 35 years, and I recently, this last year, I attended 2 sets of triplets at home in the US, which is the first time I've ever attended triplets in the US. I have done it in the field, but I've never been asked here in the US. And then in the last year, I ended up attending 2. And I would have to say that those births were very special, mostly because the women were so special. You know, they were just amazing to have the kind of strength and confidence in yourself and your ability to give birth and being willing to take the responsibility of your birth. They were just really incredible. I will never forget either one of them. I'm sure if I live to be 90 years old, I will be thinking about these 2 women because they were pretty awesome, and their births were just really beautiful. So those 2 really stand out. There are tons of moments and things, you know, when I've been in the field and with clients from years ago and working with the Amish, you know, that was all very special, and they're all special in different ways. But these 2 most recent ones come to mind.
So, what changes would you like to see in our society in respect to our attitudes towards midwifery?
Well, it would be nice if midwifery care was the standard of care and integrated into our systems. The countries that have the lowest maternal mortality rates are the ones that have, as I said in the beginning, the midwives as the primary care providers for women, and then referred to obstetricians. We need obstetricians. Women are going to need surgery. They're going to develop high risk things. But for the ones that don't, in New Zealand, every single pregnant woman that walks through the door is assigned a midwife at the beginning of her pregnancy. Every single one. She doesn't even have a choice. And they have wonderful outcomes there. We rank 55th in maternal mortality. Our rate is 32.9 in the US out of 100,000. We're behind. We just fell behind Russia. Okay, so anybody who says it's so safe to have your baby in the hospital in the US, you don't know what you're talking about. It is not safe. And it's especially not safe for women of color and in Native American women. Women of color die at 3 times the rate in our country. I'm not talking about the places I go in sub-Saharan Africa, in our country. I'm not sure exactly what it is in Canada. Canada ranks better than the U.S. in maternal mortality, but in the U.S. it's been a steady decline. Belarus is the country with the best maternal mortality, 1 in 100,000.
Wow.
Yeah, Belarus.
Certainly so much more room for improvement.
Yeah, a lot of room for improvement.
Well, a strong message to leave off with. Kristine, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. We'd love to have you back again.
No, absolutely.
You can follow Kristine, her work and teachings on a variety of platforms, podcasts, and educational offerings, including Instagram at @globalmidwife64 and Midwifery, wisdomcollective.com. Thanks again, Kristine.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
What I find so fascinating is how in some respects the act of giving birth has stayed the same over time, and yet other aspects of childbearing have changed quite significantly.
Yeah, just think about how much things have changed since our mothers gave birth in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't unheard of for women to smoke and drink during their pregnancy.
Well, there were even more than a few physicians as well smoking in that delivery room.
Yeah, totally. My mother-in-law actually just told me this week that her OBGYN offered her a Guinness to bring in her milk after she delivered her baby.
Nice.
Isn't that hilarious? I think she actually really enjoyed it. A big change now, too, is that husbands are now much more part of the process.
Yeah, that and the epidural.
Yeah. Not everybody's in favor of pain management via an epidural during delivery, but the use of the epidural tripled between 1981 and 2001 in the US. And did you know that the amount of time we spend in labor has also increased by 2 hours since the 1960s?
That's incredible.
I know. This might be accounted for by the increasing use of epidurals and perhaps older mothers and bigger babies too.
Well, the number of C-sections must have increased as well.
5.5% of women gave birth by C-section in the US back in 1970. But guess what it was just a few years ago? 32%.
Wow, that's even higher than I thought.
I know, me too. Many of these are likely required due to an emergency situation. Interestingly, however, I read that women are 60% less likely to need a C-section if they have the support of a midwife or a doula.
And what's the difference between a midwife and a doula?
Well, according to thebump.com, a midwife is a healthcare provider, while a doula is more of a childbirth coach.
Okay, got it.
Shockingly, though, even the maternal mortality rate has risen in recent years in the West.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Even in better resourced and accessible countries?
Yeah, and it's pretty disturbing. It's thought that this is the case because women are getting pregnant at an older age, also to inequities in healthcare, and to a rise in chronic health conditions. And specifically, maternal mortality rate is higher among Black women.
Well, this is all quite sobering.
Yeah, it really is something that needs much further examination.
So, remember when I tested your knowledge in our survival episode?
I do, but please don't tell me that I have to get pregnant again, because that is not happening, Walker.
No, I have pretty fascinating birth-related facts, and well, I'm curious to see how much of this you know.
Okay, hit me.
So, did you know that the body's only disposable organ is the placenta?
I didn't even know that the placenta was an organ, but now that you mention it, it makes sense.
Yep. The purpose of the placenta is to pass oxygen, nutrients, and antibodies from the mother onto the baby. And it also removes waste and carbon dioxide, which are harmful to the baby. So when the baby's born, the placenta is expelled by the mother's body.
The placenta is quite a revered object in many cultures too, right?
It is. Okay, what about this? Did you know that the uterus that has carried a baby to full term is the strongest muscle in the body?
I have heard that before.
Oh, aren't you smarty pants?
Well, I do have a uterus, Walker.
Well, apparently 80% of the pushing during delivery is done by the uterus as well.
Well, that's what all those contractions are about.
Yeah, and listen to this. Even if the mother was unconscious during labor, the uterus would still be able to push the baby out of the womb.
Really? That is super cool. I had no idea. Our bodies just know what they're doing.
Especially after having 69 children.
I'm sorry, what?
Well, between 1725 to 1765, a woman in Russia known as the wife of peasant Fyodor Vasilev had 69 children. No joking.
Come on. I can't even imagine that.
16 sets of twins, 7 sets of triplets, and 4 sets of quadruplets. Apparently, that was the most children born to one woman ever.
I wonder why she just didn't have another one and bump it up to 70.
No pun intended. I wonder. She probably had no idea how many kids she had. You know, frankly, I'd stop counting after 10.
Me too.
Now I'm going to look into how old she was when she had her last birth. I'm curious now.
I wonder if she was anywhere close to the age of Safina Namukwaya of Uganda. Just last year, at 70 years of age, she gave birth to twins after getting pregnant with the help of IVF.
Jeez, and I thought I was getting up there when I had my son at 36.
Safina became pregnant with donor eggs and a sperm from her partner. Her babies, a boy and a girl, were born prematurely via C-section at 31 weeks gestation. Both babies were over 3 pounds at birth. Having children at an older age does come with these kinds of risks, such as gestational diabetes, hypertension, and preterm labor, that can affect the mother and the baby. And that great muscle, the uterus, it might not be as strong as it was, right? Although the American Society for Reproductive Medicine does not recommend embryo transfer in women over the age of 55, after giving birth, Safina told the media, "Some might argue that 70 years is old, but God decided that I get to have twins at 70. There's no one that can put a limit on God's authority and power." Her fertility specialist, Dr. Sales, stated that it's her human right, it's her body, and she's physically fit.
Holy smokes. I would find taking care of infants exhausting at my age, let alone in my 70s.
Yeah.
Isn't the average age for women giving birth about 28?
Yeah.
Yeah, and yet more women are waiting until their 30s and 40s and even their 50s to have children.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you would have to have your will and your guardianship intact if you were really going to push the far edges of the boundaries of age, don't you think?
Right, like Maria del Carmen of Spain, who gave birth to twins in 2006 at the age of 66. She was a single mother who conceived with the help of in vitro fertilization. At the time, she was the oldest woman to become a mother. Unfortunately, she did pass away 3 years later after a battle with cancer.
Oh, that's so tragic.
It is.
But IVF does open up options to people wanting a biological child, and they should have one if they want one. After advances in IVF, it became possible for a couple to have their own biological baby through gestational surrogacy too, where a woman can be impregnated with another couple's biological embryo. IVF gives us choice about timing too, about when to have our families. People can freeze their eggs or embryos, giving them more flexibility. But it's got to be expensive, Walker.
Well, apparently a cycle of IVF can cost more than $20,000 US.
Whoa.
But even after all the cost and effort, apparently only around 10% of frozen eggs are actually used.
Really?
Also, you probably know that when women have babies later or use assisted reproductive technologies, the likelihood of having multiple births goes up as well.
Yeah, right. Like Aramati Mangayama of India, she was 74 when she gave birth to twins.
74. How old was her husband?
Somewhere between 78 and 82. Yeah, they got their hands full, Walker. I think in many instances, there are both biological and cultural pressures that contribute to a woman's decision to becoming a mom later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Much of what we do as women is influenced by cultural pressures, good and bad at times. Even down to the total number of babies we have, or if we have babies at all.
Absolutely. It's well known that the birth rate in the United States has been declining. Between 2007 and 2022, the birth rate has declined a whopping 23%.
Wow.
In the 1950s, women on average had 3 children, But now that number has dropped to 1.6, which is below the replacement rate.
Well, things have certainly changed, but women have different priorities and perhaps more choice than they did in the 50s.
Absolutely. But still, despite the prolonging of birth and having a family, it is still a central thing to our species. And as such, tradition, rite, and ceremony surrounding birth does persist in communities and cultures around the world. For instance, in Bali, there's a very old practice of conducting a ceremony in which the placenta is buried after the birth.
Now, this is practiced by many people around the globe, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. In fact, in Cambodia, the placenta is considered to be the globe of the origin of the soul. Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
It has to be buried in a special location designed to protect the baby from bad spirits. And in other cultures, the placenta is considered to be like a sibling of the baby.
Well, it is life-giving, isn't it?
It sure is. Many of the rites and rituals surrounding birth are health-giving and aimed at supporting the well-being of the mom and baby. In Turkey, for instance, did you know that a new mom will be given a beverage called lohusa sherbeti, which is a postpartum sherbet? And it sounds so yummy. It's made of water, sugar, spices like cloves and cinnamon, and red food coloring. And it's also claimed to aid in lactation.
Well, your mother-in-law got a Guinness, and now I hear about a sherbet too.
Yeah.
I think I only got ice chips.
Me too.
But it goes beyond food and drink as well. In Madagascar, water and a particular tree branch is ground into a paste to create a mason joni mask. Nome, a 21-year-old woman who wore the mask as part of a Menabawaka Jabali tradition after giving birth, was quoted as saying, "In our culture, mothers like me and our newborn babies are not allowed to go outside during the first 7 days after the birth. The mother is still suffering and the baby is still very fragile. My older sister applied a mason joni mask to my face to protect it from the sun and from all bad spirits. Once we have made it through these sacred critical 7 days, we step outside for a short time to face the reality of life and the bright sun."
That is so lovely. I love how protective and caring that ritual is. It's hard on the body, and mother and baby are so fragile.
So does your family have any traditions or rituals that they perform during a birth of a baby in the family or shortly after?
Well, I did have my lucky monkey labor socks, Walker.
That was my problem. I didn't have any lucky monkey labor socks.
Well, there you go. Everybody should have a pair. I think I still have them somewhere. I wore them for all 3 of my kids' births. But other than that, I don't think we really have any family traditions or rituals, but we do all get together when there's a baby coming. My nephew's birth, for example, was partially memorable because of the anxiety, love, and laughter that was all going on in the waiting room.
Well, we don't have any long established practices in our family, but in the 1980s, my grandfather purchased a cradle at auction, and since then, we've placed every newborn baby in the family in it. They don't sleep there, as it's probably not safe anymore, but it's a sweet tradition and a nod to my grandfather.
It's a beautiful tradition.
So here's another sweet practice, the Nigerian tradition of amugwo.
What's that?
Well, newborn babies are cleaned and swaddled after they're born, but in Nigeria, the washing of the newborn is very important. The grandmother is responsible for giving the baby its first bath. Only another female in the family, such as an aunt, can stand in if the grandmother cannot perform the first bath. It is really a beautiful practice that demonstrates to the new mom the strength and the support of the community behind her.
I love that. Being a new mom can be lonely and intimidating at any age or stage.
Oh, it certainly can. In the words of Ricky Lake, remember her? Motherhood is the greatest thing and the hardest thing. Thank you for joining us at Home and Abroad with your host, Harrison Walker. If you enjoyed this episode, you would be a real gem if you would rate and review our show. It helps us grow and expand our reach. You can also subscribe to follow us each week as we continue the conversation. Find us on Instagram at Harrison Walker or visit us at www.harrisonwalker.com. We have great merch, just saying, and of course, we would love to hear from you.